Bev, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, sure. Welcome, everybody. This is Beverly Craig at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We're really excited to host this training tool for Passive House training. And just as background, just yesterday we made an announcement of 8 Passive House Design Challenge Awards. So these are all affordable housing projects in Massachusetts. One of those is currently under construction. 4 of them are going to start construction in the spring, and it will lead to 540 apartments that are in buildings that are Passive House certified. So we're really excited about this initiative. Sort of building on the momentum of that program, which started about a year ago, the Mass Save program in Massachusetts now has an incentive program for 4 stories and above that has some early planning and feasibility money, as well as up to $3,000 per unit if you certify Passive House. And that was only announced at the end of July, and we already have 28 projects signed up and a lot of others interested. So it's really great to see this momentum around Passive House in Massachusetts. So because we funded these 8 affordable projects, one of the requirements for each of those grantees is to do 8 hours of trades training around Passive House. And that can be very specific to the building and the particular wall assemblies and, the window detailing, whatever you could do. But we thought, obviously one of the hardest parts is getting the information that general contractors and their subs need to do differently than they would in a normal project and communicating that to them. So we hired Kate Stevenson from Helm Construction Solutions. You might know Kate from, I think she was 13 years at Yestermorrow, so you might have known her then. She's working with the Studio for High Performance Design and Construction in Newton and has developed a series of checklists and agendas and tools basically that you may use as part of a design team on a Passive House project to sort of tease out the important things out of the drawings and to make sure they're addressed in the different trades training that you will have with your subs and your general contractors. So today's webinar is just basically going to have Kate run through that tool, what's there, and tell you how to use it. And we're very interested in, as people learn from projects that they initiate, for them to give us feedback on this tool. What's worth it, what's helpful, what's not, if they would suggest other approaches, other kinds of webinars, that would all be very valuable. So at the very end of the slide presentation, you'll have my contact information, and I encourage you to be in touch about what you think about these tools. Thanks so much. And Kate, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, I just want to reiterate what Beverly said about why we're doing this. When we started this project, which was almost the beginning of last winter, we really wanted to identify ways to provide training that was really custom to each project. We realized that it's not always that effective to send somebody off to sit in a classroom for half a day or a day to learn things that might be related to Passive House, but not necessarily relevant to their particular project that they're working on. So the approach that we decided to take for this project was really to first go out and talk to people who had worked on different multifamily Passive House projects here in New England for the most part. We talked to architects and general contractors and Passive House consultants and some raters, and really just tried to find out what were some of their challenges, what are some of the lessons learned from the projects that have been completed over the last few years, and then how can we translate that into some tips, recommendations, tools that will help all the projects going forward, hopefully do it better, more efficiently, and hope avoid some frustration and costly mistakes. So if nothing else, that's what we're hoping that you might get out of this process, is some things to think about for your project that that'll help avoid issues down the road. So the way that this is all set up is very customizable. We'll talk more about like how you can access the tool, but it's a simple thing. It's in Google Sheets. It's free. It's it's in a spreadsheet format. But the idea being that you can modify it, change it for your team and what's appropriate to your team. So we know every project is a little bit different, and the main thing that I think came across in all of the interviews that I did and trying to get feedback and ideas was just, these passive house projects require a significant amount of communication and coordination, more than you may have done in any previous project. So, and there are a lot of different players at the table, especially as we talk about an integrated design team and bringing all of the different trades into the project. There's a lot of people to coordinate and a lot of places where you need really clear understanding of who's doing what and who's responsible for which piece, and as different assemblies come together. So before we go any further, I just wanted to take a quick poll using the webinar poll just to get a sense of like who's in the room. If you can just click in, like if you're an architect, general contractor, just so that we have a sense of who's with us today out of the 20 or so folks listening. Great, that looks like we got mostly architects, a lot of passive house consultants, and a few general contractors. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just keep moving on. So our main goals with all of this are, our project goals are probably fairly similar across the board, but we want to deliver a project on time, on budget. We want to prevent rework, change orders, surprises, all the things that can cost money and throw off the schedule. We want to learn from our previous projects and not have to reinvent the wheel if someone else has already figured out some of these solutions. We really need to engender this idea of cooperation versus competition, because everyone needs to be on board with the goal of passive house certification for this to happen. You can't just say, oh, that's the passive house consultant's problem. We need to have everybody from the plumber's helper to all the different project managers and the design team on board to be successful. There is definitely a chance of like people being like, well, that's not my job, so I don't have to deal with that. And if you're in a project that is being competitively bid, trying to identify in advance like what those extra things are that people are going to need to do, the extra time in communication. We're part of what we can do with some of these tools is help educate folks in advance, even in the bidding process. And then at the end of the day, one of our goals is to pass and to certify these buildings. It is a pass-fail test, and there is, again, no one person responsible for passing. So we have to have everybody on board. And so we kind of just broke this down into, our focus today is on the trades, but a lot of this starts in the design phase. So what we'll be talking through with some of these tools are really defining roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, and trying to be clear about that at the launch of a project. And then how do we collect information and share it with everyone in a way that's efficient and gets them what they need to know, but without overloading them with too much information. Really recommend meeting early and often throughout the design and construction phase with members of the team. And then as you start working through some of these trainings, really trying to take the time to assess the effectiveness, what's working, what's not working, and then make adjustments and course corrections as you go along. For this to be effective, ideally, you're really developing your training plan at the beginning, while you're still in the design phase. It's going to be hard to really do this effectively kind of after the fact, halfway through construction. So starting early is a good idea. So let's talk about the tool just a little bit. There are kind of 3 components in this. When I talk about the tool, I'm referring to this Google spreadsheet, which you will all have access to. You can make a copy of it and start filling it out, sharing it with your project team. So there are 3 different sections of it. One we call the project worksheets, and it's really kind of a place to just collect and kind of have one general location where everyone on the team can refer to key information like assemblies, the project milestones, which we'll go through each of these, but some of the details. All of this stuff is going to be buried in a very extensive set of drawings. And so how can we tease out some of these details in a kind of like a quick reference cheat sheet, basically, that the whole team can look at without having to pour through hundreds of pages of detailed drawings. And these worksheets are going to be works in progress. They are going to be living documents throughout the whole project as things evolve and change. Then the second section are the training templates. And what we tried to do was just identify a number of training opportunities throughout the project. And for each one of these, provide sample agenda, some resources that you can use, kind of key things to prepare for each of these training events, and hopefully just give you a framework to get it started. And then the last section of the tool just has a list of resources, really kind of both links to websites, links to documents, books that kind of are specifically around multifamily and passive house. So trying to just pull together in one place resources that your team might find useful. In spending the last year or so just kind of asking lots of people and cruising around the internet, there's not a ton out there that's specific to multifamily passive house. So we're trying to just collect all of those links and videos and courses that that might be relevant and have them all in one place. So what we're going to do, and I'll just want to put a note out there that if you have questions as you go along, there is the little questions box within the GoToWebinar menu. And so please type in your questions. We've got time for questions at the end of this. So throw them in there, and we'll take the last 15 minutes or so to go through questions. But at the risk of, we're not going to show you some of the screenshots from the spreadsheets. It's not eye candy, but we'll try and just go through so you have a sense of what's included in the tool. So again, this in the first section, the project information section, we're looking to just provide name, contact information for all the people on the team. And this may be customized based on you'll need to customize it based on who's involved in your project. As you start, this is more on the design side. As you start to identify who the trades contractors are, you probably want to include all of them here too, so that you have a sense of like who we need to coordinate with in different parts of the process. The second tab is really about just to kind of clarify certification so that everyone on the team knows, are we doing FEIS Plus, we're doing PHI, what are our airtightness goals in our model, what are some things like set point, and then what other programs are we participating in that we need to keep in mind throughout the whole project that may have other requirements that we need to pay attention to. The milestones is kind of one of the beefier sections in my opinion, and it's basically a way of trying to get out a project schedule. So you may have another tool that you're using for scheduling, both in the design and the construction phase, but this may have a few milestones that aren't in a typical construction schedule. So things like doing an energy charrette. And so for each one of these, we try to just identify kind of what would be included in that milestone, and then there are blanks for you to fill in. Who should be at that meeting, basically? When is it happening? And where we have resources, we link to the different sample agendas for some of the kind of more training related ones. There are other toolkits for everything from like how to put on a good charrette to what are the requirements that FIAS or PHI might have at this phase of the process. So some of these are standard design things like CD review. Some of these things may be different, like having a pre-bid meeting with various trades contractors so that they really understand what they're bidding on before they submit their bids, because that will eliminate a lot of change orders down the road potentially. We want to, this may change if you're not going through a competitive bidding process and doing more of a construction management approach. Every project is going to be a little bit different. These things may come in different order. But ideally, your team together is meeting and talking through each of these steps and these milestones and identifying, who needs to be there at that point in the process and when are we going to do it. Whether you can put a specific day or whether you put like beginning of December, and maybe it gets more detailed as some of those things get closer. So again, this is just kind of going through different things that may be different in a passive house project, like when you may be needing to do your preliminary blower door test, some of the things that the rater might be visiting for, like looking at insulation quality, compartmentalization, commissioning. Our fourth sheet is about assemblies. And again, we're not going to be able to necessarily capture like all. I can imagine like some of the architects in the audience being like, "How we can't write all of these things, just in a little table." But we're trying to just identify what are some of the key assemblies, like underwall assembly. Maybe if it's a low-rise, wood construction building, they're just saying something like 2x6, 24-inch on center with cellulose infill, and 3 inches of exterior polyiso. I'm just making up a random wall assembly, but there may be different assemblies in different parts of the building, so we tried to accommodate that. Obviously, you can add and delete sections as needed, but we want just, again, think about this as kind of the cliff notes, the cheat sheet that someone who might be coming in and just wants to get like a quick sense of what's this building type look like, can see the description, are there specific specifications or materials, and then who is responsible. In this section, you'll see that on the different sheets, but in this section, who is responsible? It's really trying to identify like who are the key trade contractors that will be part of that assembly. So for example, like subslab vapor barrier, that there might be one contractor coming in and laying down the foam and putting down the stego wrap, and then before the concrete guys show up, and those two need to be coordinated so that they don't go and trim off the extra stego wrap that you were planning on taping up onto your wall. So things like that are often the points, those places where the two trades come together are key place for communication, and where things can often kind of either get missed between the two trades or miscommunicated, like, oh, I thought you were doing that. No, I thought you were doing that. So if we can try and in advance identify like who's gonna, you know, whether it's the concrete subcontractor, you know, lead person, and you write in their name, or, you know, at least identify the name of the trade contractor company that will be doing that detail. And then ideally, if you can link to the actual plans and details or spec sheet, great. That we provide for that too. Similar idea with the MEP details. For the description, we just want to know, okay, maybe the description is 1-to-1 mini splits. The specification is Mitsubishi model XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Who is responsible for installing that equipment, and then again, link to maybe a spec sheet or submittals. You know, one of the things that came up again and again in the interviews that I did with other project teams was the importance of submittals, and really trying to articulate to the trade contractors that they can't just substitute something. You know, if something's in the plans this way and they can't find that at the lumberyard, and they can't just, you know, switch it out for something that seems similar, because on the mechanical side, it could really throw off the energy model. So the submittals of the actual spec sheets and everything are very important and can save a lot of headaches down the road. And then we added in a little section here for compartmentalization. Compartmentalization of the apartment units, it's not a requirement of Passive House specifically, but we wanted to include it just under the assumption that if you're going for Passive House, you're probably going for Energy Star, and Energy Star does require compartmentalization, and it's a key part of the whole air sealing strategy. So really understanding as a group, what are the targets that we need to hit? Often, you know, that might be broken down by apartment types, and then thinking about what exactly are the details around things like elevators, stairwells, trash chutes, sprinkler, party wall, all of those details in advance before we get to interior partition construction. So there is a whole training agenda around compartmentalization if you choose to use that. So now we're going to the second section, which is the training roadmap. Again, kind of the agendas. And because I think most of us who are doing this kind of work don't necessarily come with a teaching degree or training and facilitation credentials, you know, I wanted to just include some tips for running a training. And these may be kind of basic, but it's always helpful to identify at the beginning of practically every meeting, but, you know, in this process, like who's going to be the convener, and that involves figuring out when we're going to have the meeting, sending the reminders, sending out an agenda, having someone who's going to take notes and distribute them. Maybe there's someone who didn't make it to the meeting and they need to get the notes afterwards. A facilitator's role is really to make sure the meeting stays on track, that everyone's time is being used wisely, and that everyone's voice is being heard throughout the discussion. And then you might also have a verifier who's kind of like following up just to make sure people are doing what they said they were going to do, making sure that these things actually got done in the field, and documenting the construction process. So, you know, you do have your FIAS or rater or a verifier, but one of the lessons that we heard also was document as much as you can. You know, we all walk around with phones in our pockets these days, and so snapping a picture of different details before things got covered up, you know, being able to go back and pull those out later as part of the certification process can be really valuable. So, you know, having someone kind of designated to go around and just make sure that we're capturing photographic evidence of the different parts of the construction as it goes up. And then the role of the training coordinator is also just making sure that We've set times for these different trainings, the agendas, so it's similar to a convener, but making sure all the right people are there, documenting. So, one person might wear multiple of these hats at the same time, but it's helpful to know, like, within your own team, who's going to be doing what. So we'll just go through the 6 different training agendas and then dive into, kind of talk just in brief about what each of these could look like in your process. So the first one is project kickoff, really as early as possible, and ideally with the general contractor as soon as they've been selected. So this may be different on different projects depending on whether it's competitive bid or other construction model. But basically, it's kind of your first opportunity to bring everybody together. You can start filling out some of these sections of the worksheet, making sure that you talk about how often you're going to meet. Again, roles and responsibilities, thinking about just talking as a group about the key milestones and what the schedule looks like, the basic assemblies, specifications, and your submittal process, the rater and review process. So it's really just getting everyone up to speed at the beginning of the project. And we like to talk about this idea of the pre-mortem instead of just a post-mortem. There's a link there to an article from Fine Home Building a couple years ago, but it's a fun exercise to do at the beginning of a project where basically you try to think about all the things that could go wrong and then think about what could we do now to anticipate those and try and head it off at the pass and avoid some of those potential problems. The second training is really around construction kickoff. We put together an introduction webinar to multifamily passive house a couple months ago. Some of you may have been on that webinar as well. We've got a video of it and we have the slide deck available. So whether you encourage folks to watch it on their own time, you all watch it together, or you modify the slide deck to suit your project, just as a way to introduce the idea of passive house. Once you've got some of these key members of your team on board. And then as you're getting close to construction, like you'll see in these next training agendas, a lot of them require a mock-up, both for the air sealing training. So we have to figure out who's going to build the mock-up, when do we need it ready by, what needs to be included in that. And then ideally at this construction kickoff, we're really nailing down some of the date and time for the upcoming trainings. Because once you get into construction, these trainings are all, well, they're kind of front-loaded towards the beginning of the construction process. But thinking about who will lead the different trainings, again, not one person on your team is going to do all of them. So you really have to, as you get through into these different topics, think about who's the person that's best suited to kind of convene this training and lead us through the process. There's also some suggestions down here about like how to run a great workshop, and we'll talk about some of those tips as well. But in some of these trainings, yeah, you're potentially having filled out the project information, then you can be sharing those with the group, and that's part of the training. It's kind of just walking through some of the assemblies and systems. The envelope air sealing training, this is really probably the first one where you're like on site, things are starting to happen. We've got a mock-up. Hopefully it involves a window. And we're really starting to look at like the wall assembly, things like window flashing. Ideally, we have some detailed drawings that we can look at. Talk about different air sealing strategies, what materials can be used in what locations, who's responsible for closing holes that have been drilled by various trades. And again, reviewing the submittal process. There are some good resources around air sealing, both videos and some kind of short handouts that might be useful. Then once you're kind of into framing, then it's a question of bringing all the MEP trades on together. Plumbers, electricians, HVAC, maybe there's a solar contractor, maybe there are other specialized trades, and kind of bringing them on board to, again, every time they drill a hole, like how are they going to seal it? What different materials are supposed to be used and for what different application? Ideally in the mock-up, you might have some penetrations there where you can show kind of how to seal in different types of assemblies. The mock-up's not going to show all the different places, but really helping them understand that each of those trades are responsible for closing their own holes, ideally, and really talking through the sequencing and the schedule and who goes in first and how do things potentially overlap. And I think that's definitely one strategy for kind of making this be not just a presentation but a conversation, is asking people, getting all these folks in the room and asking them, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for you? How can we as a team make your job easier going forward? What's one takeaway that you're gonna have to pay attention to that might be different from your average project? So getting people talking is always helpful. And part of this is also letting them know about the blower door test, which is going to be coming up, what things will need to be completed on their end before you can do the blower door test. I know on my projects, like we have been trying to do it after mechanicals are in, so that then we can, part of what we're testing with the blower door is that all those penetrations are well sealed, but it does require some taping things off. So then blower door test is kind of a, it could be a whole day. We started out saying like, this is a 2-hour training, and then we're like, actually, like a lot of the times it ends up being a whole day. There might be a shorter training part at the beginning, and then the rest of it is kind of depends on how things go, but chasing leaks around. But this just goes through kind of who you probably want there for that first test, what needs to happen in preparation beforehand in terms of taping things off. If you're going to go chase leaks, then what materials you want to have on hand, ready to go, covering the openings, and then like making sure someone is going to walk through and make sure that all that prep is done the day before the test. And then on the day of the testing, putting up notices to make sure people aren't coming through. Again, reviewing the overall air sealing, the tightness strategy, the tightness target, running the blower door. I know some teams have used the theatrical fog to really to be able to pinpoint certain challenging areas and see if there is air leakage coming through. And then, there's a celebration aspect, ideally, to the blower door test. One of the fun things about doing these is like seeing teams, like how excited they get and how proud they are that they hit their numbers. And so, really not just blowing past that, but really taking time to celebrate, ideally. And if you haven't hit your number, then understanding kind of what the strategies are, when you're going to come back and retest, and then kind of there's having to unmask all the things that you've masked. And then compartmentalization review might be an on-site training, or it might be more of just a team meeting, but really reviewing the compartmentalization targets, talking about some of the specific places where compartmentalization is an issue, and if those relate to your project. Ideally this is happening as early as possible, like even still in the design process. The team is thinking about this, but at the latest, it's before your interior partition framing is going in. And there are some good resources for how to test. It is challenging to test individual apartments at this kind of mid-construction stage. So let's just talk a little bit about a couple more minutes to talk about kind of how to run a good training. Be strategic about who's in the room. You don't want to waste anybody's time. So make sure that they really do need to be there, and that you're, when you start to have some of these trainings and you get 10 people in a room, there's thousands of dollars of billable hours. So you want to be strategic about who's there, sending the agenda in advance so that they know what to expect, starting on time, ending on time, respecting people's time. Make sure that everybody gets a reminder the day before. I really like to cap everything at 2 hours, because you can see people's eyes glaze over. Sometimes it takes less than 2 hours, but planning for a 3 or 4 hour meeting, it's going to be hard to really engage folks for that long. Make sure you got coffee and snacks, and kind of bring people to the table, and keeping the handouts limited. I think for some of these, you do really want detailed drawings. Maybe it's just a blow up of a very specific air sealing detail, or kind of showing where the air barrier is within the different assemblies. But again, you think about who's going to be in the room, and if it's plumbers and electricians, and make the handouts relevant to them, make it that they don't have to dig and search for the information, the key information. And if you have subcontractors who some of them maybe not have English as their native language, then it's worth thinking about, is there any translation required? Maybe some parts of this handout need to be in Spanish or another language. So that's just something to think about. So we will send this out as the follow-up to this webinar, but this is a short link to go to the actual tool. And then how to use it is basically, probably a lot of you have used Google Sheets before, but basically you will be able to go to this link, see the tool. You won't be able to make any changes to it. So what you have to do is kind of do make a copy, save as, make your own version of it for your project. You can start filling in some of the details depending on where you are in your process, and then share it with the folks on your team. And as part of this, roles and responsibilities is designating, not that one person has to be the one filling in all these blanks, because I think a lot of them you really need to do as a group, but ideally there are one or two people who kind of take on responsibility for keeping the spreadsheet updated and filling things in as the projects evolve. So these are all things we just talked about, but clarifying roles and responsibilities, plan ahead. It can be hard to schedule things really far in advance, like a blower door test, because you really don't always know until the week before if everything's going to be ready. But the more that within the milestones, you can at least kind of put in a target mid-November. That's when we think all the windows will be in, or at least give people a sense of the target schedule, and then as you get closer, it might get more granular as to the actual day and the actual time. Using your time efficiently, and then collecting feedback after each training. That's always a good idea. Kind of find out what's working, if people feel like it's useful or not. And that said, we want your feedback too, as Beverly said at the beginning. This is something that we've been working on for the last few months. and we expect it to grow and change and evolve over time. And so Beverly's going to be collecting any feedback that you have for us, and then we may reissue, a new version at some point down the road, and welcome folks' ideas about that. And I guess just before we switch over to the questions, a couple things that just to go back to kind of tips for training that I didn't touch on already was, I think one of the key things when we're talking with some of these trades contractors, you're asking them to do something that they've probably never done before, and it's probably making their job harder. So part of what you need to do is to be able to kind of play to their ego and talk to commend them for their skills and their expertise. I'm like, wow, we're so glad that we have you working on this project, because you're the greatest plumber we've ever had. Maybe not quite, but remind them that this is different, but that this is also a learning opportunity for them, and that this is kind of where the industry is headed, and this is going to give them a competitive edge going forward if they can understand these high performance building techniques. And that the end result is really going to be a better building that we can all be proud of as a team. And then one of the other just tips that came through in our interviews and talking with folks is also to consider including your manufacturer reps in some of these trainings. So depending on the materials and systems that you're using, you might have someone from Zip System come, to your air sealing envelope training, to talk about how do you use their tapes and things that are specific to their product installation. Maybe there's someone from Mitsubishi who comes to the MEP thing to talk about their particular product installation that's important. So some of the things that may be new and are helpful to do in those on-site kind of fairly hands-on trainings are, how to roll the tape, and what is the sequence of window flashing and the different tapes that you're using there. Maybe you're using European windows that have clips instead of flanges, and it's a different window install technique. And then how you're making these connections between the sub-slab vapor barrier to the wall, the top of the wall, air barrier, different strategies for sealing penetrations. We talked a little bit, but so those are the kind of hands-on things that may be different in your passive house projects that you really want to review with the trades contractors. So, couple of different additional resources. Again, there's a long list of resources in the actual tool, but TIAS, National North American Passive House Network, and Passive House Massachusetts all have resources on their sites. And at this point, we want to open it up for some questions and see what folks think, how you think you might be able to use it. Anybody have any questions at this point? Really, no one has any questions?
Maybe tell everybody where to type it in. Maybe it's not clear.
So in the GoToWebinar little, I don't know what you call it, the menu, you can either, you can either type in a question, or you can do what they call raise your hand, and we can unmute you and you can actually ask the question. So either of those work.
So is it under chat, Kate?
On my screen, I see it under questions. Okay, I got one. Let's see. I don't see the question though. Kurt Lamar. What's the cost for going passive house? Beverly, you want to try and take that one?
Sure. Well, it really depends. So the 8 affordable projects that we just awarded money to all believe they can do it for less than a 3% premium. Pennsylvania is probably the furthest along in actually building projects, and those were all low-income housing tax credit projects, and they are compared to the same square footage costs of non-passive house. They saw a 0 to 2% increase. There's certainly plenty of New York developers who say that they could do it at 0 premium, but I mean, so in Massachusetts, there would be certain categories of things that would be higher and others that wouldn't, right? So I think we tend to find in multifamily buildings, the amount of insulation is not necessarily a whole lot more than you'd have to do for stretch code in the walls and the roof. So that should not be an additional cost. But air tightness will be 4 to 5 times more airtight than stretch code would be. So that might involve a little more training or attention to detail for folks in air sealing and compartmentalization. Sometimes you have to, because multifamily does get, generally the issue is overheating, not, so you have to, they tend to be cooling load dominated in multifamily buildings. So in that case, you want to be very careful about shading. And so a lot of passive house will incorporate some kind of shading features, which would be an additional cost. In terms of ventilation, historically, you would have to bring fresh air to every bedroom and heat recovery for that. Now code in Massachusetts for multifamily has caught up with that, so that should not be an incremental cost. Of course, you'll have contractors saying, oh, I get by just having operable windows, but any place that they actually do enforcement, that is not going to be true. And then because the heat loads are so much smaller, so we do tend to find, compared to a Massachusetts stretch code built multifamily, that passive house certified buildings are using approximately 40% overall less energy. So most of that's in the heating and cooling, right? Plug loads are probably going to be about the same. Hot water maybe slightly lower, and same thing with lighting, but it's mostly in the heating and cooling being smaller. And what that means is that you actually can save money. So you'll hear engineers, MEP engineers, say that they love to design for passive house because, like a LEED Gold building, they're often not sure whether the model is going to actually play out. It's pretty typical to be off by 35% off that model. So they have to be careful about what they design, and they can't downsize a whole lot. With passive house, you're talking about a load that's going to be about 40% less. And because of all the blower door and construction verification, it's pretty rare to be off by more than 10% off of a WUFI or PHPP model. So that means the engineer can really downsize that equipment. So you may have some incremental costs from shading or additional air sealing, but you're going to save some money on the mechanicals. So until our 8 are, we're tracking the incremental costs very closely on these 8 projects, but we do think it's going to be a pretty small premium. And like I said, there is the Mass Save incentive program, which gives you a $3,000 per unit incentive. So hopefully that can take some of the bite out of any incremental costs that might be there.
Yeah, and that also helps cover some of the modeling costs as well, right?
Right. So it covers $5,000 for a feasibility study, which is basically just free green building advice, which you can take it or leave it, right? So I don't see why anyone wouldn't use that. And then there's 75% up to $20,000 per building for the passive house energy modeling. And we've heard definitely examples where that's been an incredibly helpful value engineering tool. So for example, somebody in schematics might have put more insulation in, then when you run the model, you find out in the walls you don't really need all that. So you're able to take that out. Or the shading analysis as part of the energy model. I know in the Cambridge project, Icon had originally designed shading features on all 4 sides, and when they ran the model on 2 sides, it barely moved the energy performance. So they were able to take it out on two sides. And I know it can be very helpful previewing different possible wall assemblies with general contractors for buildability compared to the energy performance of those different walls. So you can have sort of a feel for the cost versus energy performance trade-off in different wall assemblies.
Great. And then one of our next questions was about the potential to retrofit existing multifamily buildings to Passive House standards.
It's a great idea. It is expensive. I mean, that is definitely what Energy Sprong is trying to do in Europe. It's spreading like wildfire there, but you really need to build up enough demand to get panelization manufacturers much more common to do that kind of work. I don't see it here yet. There is really interesting work in New York, the Retrofit New York effort, which is sort of an Energy Sprong model. They're lucky in Europe because a lot of their housing is much more similar to one another. We have a lot more diversity here, but New York has chosen a few building types to try and build this Energy Sprong model around. So it'll definitely be worth watching what comes out of New York.
Great, and one of the other questions was just about how are we going to share the links to the Google Sheet. So I pulled it up here, but we'll also send a follow-up email after the webinar to everybody who was on it with the link as well. So we are in the process of getting kind of all of these resources linked off of the Mass CEC site and Passive House Massachusetts. So we don't have all of those up yet, but I would say in the next couple weeks we'll make sure that people can link to this, so that if 6 months from now you're finally ready to start your project and you're like, what was that Google Sheet?
Yeah, just if you Google Mass CEC Passive House, you'll find everything that we have. And then Passive House Massachusetts is probably going to be listing everything as well. So you can always come back to it. And already we have on our webpage at Mass CEC the 1 hour sort of intro where there's a lot of examples of multifamily in New England, which were really helpful. And I think Kate's interviews with people, there were a lot of lessons learned towards the end that I thought were really interesting, or especially around humidity. Passive House Mass, with support from the Mass Save program and through ICF, is going to be continuing doing a lot of training. So Tim McDonald and David Salomon just did a program about a week and a half ago that was video recorded. That's going to be showing up on the Passive House Mass website very soon. That was a fantastic I think it's really good for architects in particular about how to think differently before they even put any pencil down to draw anything about a Passive House project. So I'd highly recommend looking at that as well. And in general, Passive House Mass is providing, for most of the webinars, if you watch them, you can take a quiz at the end and get a certificate for an hour of training. So that's useful, I think, especially for people who are just starting to get some expertise around it, to show how many hours they've put in.
So I guess we get one other question just before we wrap up. I think we've got a couple minutes left, but so it's to what extent have you found or hear of these tools helping to increase communication on items with many stakeholders, like air sealing?
So we haven't used these yet, right? This is our hope,
right.
Is that it'll help. And that's where we want feedback. So the 8 projects that were funded through Passive House Design Challenge do have to do 8 hours of trades training. It can be with any of these categories of things or others if they want. They'll need to document sort of what date that was, sort of what the agenda was that was talked about, and sort of a sign-in sheet for those 8 hours. Everybody else that's doing Passive House that's not formally under our grant program, we hope this is a useful tool for them. I think, we were thinking multifamily, but I think it applies to just about, any kind of Passive House certification, single family, office, whatever. So hopefully this will be useful. We hope so. That's the reason we put it together.
Exactly. Well, great. Yeah, and David's on the webinar, and who did the presentation last week, and wanted to let people know that also there is the Passive House conference coming up soon, and they'll be presenting there as well. So
yeah, in early December in Washington, D.C.
Yep. So that's another opportunity for folks who are kind of getting up to speed on Passive House, or have been doing it for a long time, but there's always something new to learn there.
Yeah, and I think Passive House Mass just recently had their symposium, which was a day of projects and specific information about different strategies. I think those the slideshows for all the presentations are up, so if you didn't catch it, you can at least get the slides and take a look at those too.
Great. Well, if there aren't any last questions, I think we can probably wrap it up here. Thanks everyone for participating, and please, as Beverly said, try it out. Let us know how it's working for you and what we can do to make it better over time. Thanks everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks.